Jackson interviewing Laura Hoch, October the 16th, 1984. Laura, tell me about the first relatives that came to No Man's Land, and what year did they come?
That would be my grandfather, George Washington Petty, and his wife, who came here in 1885. They were among the very first white people to settle here. They lived in a dugout, and most of their children came with them, but the younger ones were born after they arrived here, and they found out that it was a very interesting place to live. Grandfather had wanted to move to Texas, but when grandmother saw this area, she said, "No, this is my home. This is where I want to stay." And they did stay there, and they became successful farmers or ranchers, because they had cattle as well as doing all the farming. And of course, that was when you walked behind your plow. It was pulled by a horse, or possibly more than that if you had the larger plow. You hoed your corn. You didn't go out and work it by team or any other way. Grandfather said, "You hoe the corn," and that was the way it was worked. My dad, who was Alfred Petty, and my aunt Ethel Petty, said that for entertainment, grandfather would give them seed, and they would go down and feed the fish. That was their job, was to feed the fish.
You lived on a creek?
Right on the Camp Creek, yes.
On Camp Creek.
Fed into the Kiowa River. And it was a nice-sized creek. He put in a large vineyard. There were always lots of grapes. He had a huge garden, several acres. And Grandmother Petty spent a good share of her time taking garden vegetables to different families in the country. I remember riding with her in the buggy, and we would go all over the country and take fruit, because they had apple trees, peach trees, pear trees, and we took fruit to various people. But that was one of her jobs, was to see that everybody had fresh vegetables and fruit whenever they had it.
That's wonderful. What state did they come from?
Indiana.
And why did they move here?
Everyone was talking about going west, so they decided to go west. And someone had told him how wonderful Texas was, that it was the most wonderful place in the world and dirt cheap to live there. But when they stayed the night, they had arrived here, Grandmother said, "No farther, this is my home." And so that's why they stayed in Oklahoma.
How did they come? Did they come by covered wagon, or?
Yes, they came by covered
all the
wagon.
way through from Indiana?
Yes, and I've forgotten now, but it told from Kansas, I believe it was, on down here, that it took, 17 days. It was in the winter time, I believe it was, and it took 17 days to come through. And I don't have any idea how long it took to come all the rest of the distance, because I never did hear them say.
Mm-hmm.
But they did.
Did they bring their cattle with them? And
yes, the older boys walked and drove the cattle.
mm-hmm. All right, and when they settled on this beautiful creek with the high grass, I suppose the grass was good along that creek.
Yes, it was very good.
Uh-huh. They had how many children at that time? Can you name their children for me and tell me which ones was born here?
Well, the ones that Grover and Harry.
Oh, tell me about
Sadie were born before they arrived, and then Ethel and Alfred and Gertie and May after they arrived here.
Tell me about them naming their children after the presidents.
I have never known the reason why, but grandfather was George Washington, Petty, so I decided that he just liked the president's name.
Mhm.
And Grover was Grover Cleveland. And then there was Cal, a member of the family. It was Calvin Coolidge.
Well,
And it was just
it's just
something that he liked.
that
was
he liked.
presidents that I suppose that he liked, and he
Mhm.
wanted them named after the presidents.
And then which ones were born here?
The ones that were born here were Ethel, Alfred, Gertie, and May.
And May was supposed to have been the first
White child born in no man's land.
Mhm.
The Indians were still here, and I have heard them talk about grandmother taking the youngsters and hiding whenever she would see the Indians coming, because she didn't know whether they were friendly or not, but found
Mhm.
out that they were. And they used to trade with the Indians and had a good many trinkets, but no one thought anything about it, and they weren't saved.
Well,
Because I remember my dad had a lot of Indian trinkets that he had traded for, and we just didn't think to save those things. We didn't realize that later on we would give anything to have them.
mhm. And how close was their closest neighbor?
There were other dugouts within just a very short distance, I would say a mile or two from them
Mhm.
at that time.
Mhm.
And the Tafts lived on to the north, and they were about, I imagine, about 3 miles from
Mhm.
where they lived. And I remember when I was small, of course this was much later, but Grover Stevenses lived just across the highway, or the road that was made through there from them. And in fact, I was born at Grandfather Petty's place.
Oh, you were born on that
I
place.
was
Mhm.
born there.
Do you, can you tell me when they built their sod house? You said or
Offhand, I can't think.
is there any part of that sod house still standing?
Well, no, not the first, the dugout, but the house, yes. And the house was all interlined with sod that is
Oh.
still there, that the hired help live in.
I see.
Or at least they were living there the last I knew. But they lived in that house, yes.
And that farm that is still in some member of the family owns it.
Yes, Robert Taft owned the place after his mother died. It was because she took care of Grandmother Petty in her later years, was given the place, and then Robbie took it over, and
And Robbie's mother is
May Taft.
May Petty Taft.
May Petty Taft,
Yes.
yes. And May stayed there with Grandmother while she was ill, and then at one time she did live with Ethel Petty Criswell in Laverne, but then she went back and stayed with May, and May stayed with her until she died.
Mhm.
And that way the place, then they let May have the place, and it belongs to Ida Taft.
Mhm.
Still has it.
Robbie's
And then Frances,
widow.
who is
And
married
his
to
daughter. Mhm.
the prophet. And
Well,
they run the place.
Your grandfather then expanded and how many acres did he finally accumulate?
Oh, I know that he had a section there, but I couldn't say just
How much more?
how much more. I think that the section is what he owned, but he did farm
Mhm.
around farther out.
Okay. Did they have any schools in those days?
Yes, the Bluegrass School.
Was it organized especially for these people that were there?
I couldn't tell you what year it was organized. Probably it tells in this article, that we had read.
But that's where May went to school.
It was,
and all of your.
my father went to school there, yes.
Mhm.
And it stood until not too many years ago, but then many of the Pettys and the Tafts both went there to school.
Well, and that was the Bluegrass School.
Bluegrass School,
Mhm.
yes.
All right, let's go on to your your father then. His name was
Alfred
Alfred
Petty.
Mhm. And he went to school at Bluegrass. What did he do? What was his chore on the farm as a young boy growing up?
Well, they had, because of this large grape vineyard that they all had to work in that. And then they all did some farming. And like I say, grandfather expected the corn to be hoed, not
Mhm.
worked in any other way. Each of them had a job of some kind. And milking cows, they had quite a few cattle.
Mhm.
And my father was particularly interested in cattle. And when he and my mother married, they lived close to Beaver and worked on a ranch. And
Do you remember whose ranch?
oh, I'm not sure. Wells. They were up by the Wellses who lived close to Beaver, and I'm not sure that he didn't work for the Wells family. But I was so tiny. I was born a year after they were married. And I was so tiny that they didn't always take me with them. They left me at my grandfather Petty's place, and my Aunt Ethel took care of me.
Mhm.
But she told that if she didn't take me out in my little carriage in the evening for a walk, I always cried. And she remembered quite well that she took care of me. But then Dad bought land from the Wellses on to the west of Grandfather Petty's, and we lived there for many years, and he built up quite a ranch. But then in the 1930s, when stock market went broke, of course all of the ranchers around lost their holdings, and we left the ranch at that time. However, there's Thelma and Rowena,
Those are your sisters.
my sisters, and we went on to school,
Mhm.
and we moved up to the Schumann place close to Laverne. But at one time, Dad ran over 2,000 head of cattle.
That was before the Depression.
That was just before the Depression, and the men who were caught with so many cattle, like my father was, were the ones that went down
Mhm.
because cattle just dropped to nothing.
Yes.
But we used to go out on horses and help with the cattle.
You girls did?
We did. I remember many times crossing the Kiowa River on a horse when it was up, and we'd get washed down the creek, and sometimes we'd get caught in the quicksand, but thought nothing of it because we'd ridden horses all of our lives.
Mhm.
In fact, I was 8 days old the first time I was on a horse.
Oh, tell us about it. How
My
come?
mother said that that was the only way they had of traveling, and because she and my father wanted to go someplace, well, they took me on the horse, and we went to our neighbors.
Mhm.
Grover Stevens lived close by, and we would go visit them. And
Would she just hold you in her arms?
hold me in her arms and carry me
Well,
on the horse.
Mhm.
And
did any of your uncles have to go to World War I that you can remember?
none that I remember of going to the war.
Uh-huh.
They were all farmers, all needed on the farm,
Mhm.
because they expanded, each married and went on to farms, and the
Mhm.
farmer was so necessary that
Yes.
they had to stay with their farms and keep them
Mhm.
going.
Oh, when did your father buy the ranch out there that I can remember you living on? And whose ranch was that originally? But who did he buy that from? there where Sittons, lived?
It seemed to me that that was Wells' place. I can't think whether it was Frank Wells. There were different boys, and
Or Bill Wells?
well, I don't know why, but the name Frank Wells comes to my mind, and I may be mistaken there.
Mhm.
But we lived there for a number of years. And
Do you know the history of the sod house? Who built that sod house that your parents lived in?
whoever lived there before we did
Yes.
built it. So I suppose that the Wellses built the house.
I see. Hmm. That was quite an outstanding sod house. It was a large one, wasn't it? How
Yes.
many rooms did it have?
There was a kitchen with a little pantry on it, and 2 bedrooms, and what we considered as a large living room at that time.
Mm-hmm.
But that was rather a large house at that time,
Yes, that's
because people just didn't build large homes.
didn't build large sod houses. Too much work,
No.
wasn't it?
Yes, with a sod house, and it was very cool in the summertime, and it was warm in the wintertime. It never
Mhm.
needed a lot of heat. We butchered, hung our beef up in the trees during the winter, let them down because they would be frozen all winter long, sawed off the meat that we needed,
Mm-hmm.
and if there was still meat, Mother would can it, and steak was very good canned. And I've never heard of canned steak since then, but Mother would can it in the oven.
I was going to ask you how she canned it. She put it in the jars?
In the jars, in the oven.
In the oven?
In the oven.
And then have it set a certain temperature?
Yes.
And how long would she cook it there? 2 hours? 3 hours?
I think about 2 hours, if I remember correctly. But it was delicious.
Yes.
But we were never without meat because, as I say, it stayed frozen through the winter, and then saw to it that there was meat to be canned, and then we had chickens. We dressed lots of chickens. And
What about wild game?
yes, we had duck, sometimes geese, and I remember prairie chickens, quail, rabbits. Everybody ate rabbit.
Mm-hmm.
There were those who ate possum.
Oh, there were?
Oh, yes. Quite definitely.
Were you bothered with wild coyotes or?
There were lots of coyotes.
And
Yes,
bobcats?
many times I went with my dad and we'd go out and dig a den of coyotes out.
Mhm.
Yes, there were lots of coyotes. And I don't remember the bobcats bothered, but there were cougars. There were times when you would hear them cry. You could walk up through the trees, and there were many trees, and go on to our neighbors, the Woodwards, on to the south of us, and walk up through there, and you could hear they always said the cougar sounded like a woman crying when it made its sound.
Mhm.
But you could go through the trees and hear them.
Didn't that scare you?
Well, people didn't think too much about it.
They didn't bother people, though.
No, they didn't bother anyone. No one thought anything about it.
Mhm.
And I think, other than one rattlesnake, I never saw a rattlesnake in all my years on the ranch.
Well.
But Bill Taft and I were going to my uncle's cow paddy to the west to see about some cattle, and as we rode across the pasture,
Were you horseback?
we were on horses. The horse shied and looked down, and Bill said, "Oh, there is a rattlesnake." And that's the only time I ever saw a rattlesnake on the
Well.
ranch.
Did your mother raise gardens too and can?
Yes, we had huge gardens, and during the Depression, when everyone was so short of food, she took garden stuff to many people. But we had a river right to the north of us, the Kiowa River, and we had this huge garden. Bill Taft figured out a way to irrigate from the Kiowa River right up through our garden, and we've had tomatoes, beans, potatoes, everything. And we took lots of them to our neighbors.
People were prone to divide at that time.
Oh, yes.
If your neighbor had something that you didn't, they would divide with you.
Everyone helped one another out. And I said that my grandmother took things many times. And not only that, but I heard different ones of my neighbors say that they would not have made it through that flu, that terrible flu, if it had not been for my grandmother and grandfather helping them out. Said they just saved their lives. The things that they brought them to eat and the care that they gave them. Said there had been no other way they'd made it through.
Your family, I guess, all had the flu.
My father was quite ill one night with the flu, and the doctor, Watts, happened to be out in our area. And he stopped at our house. He said my dad would not have lived another 15 minutes if he hadn't have made it, because his heart was just almost to stop. But he got his heart going again, and I had the flu, and they told me I wouldn't make it. But my mother put an onion poultice on me, brought me out of pneumonia, and I am still here. Thelma had the flu, but the doctor said, whatever you do, keep cut onion in your house, and said that will keep you from taking the flu. Mother kept cut onion in the house, and neither she nor our hired help had the flu. And the doctor said I keep a cut onion in my car at all times. And he said I have not taken the flu. And many, many people died at that time with the flu. And what the cut onion had to do with it, but I do know that I read later that the Russians use cut onion for many infections.
Maybe we'd better learn something there.
But
are you still keeping cut onions in your house
quite
today?
often. People have made fun of me because I ate onions so much and kept onion in my house, but I still believe in them. But many of the old ways of doing things are still good.
I noticed that they're going back to the old ways and different things that they used to think was the old lady's myth, you know.
Yes, I'm reading that the Mayo Clinic still says that your good homemade chicken soup is one of your better cold medicines.
That's right. I read that too. And I'm glad that the Mayo Clinic has come out with that, because people will believe them.
Yes.
But my mother always fed us whenever one of us got sick. That's the first thing she did, was cook chicken.
I say it still
And I do
works.
too. And I bet you do too.
Oh, yes.
All right. What was your chores now after you got old enough to help your father and mother? What was your chores?
We helped with the cattle. Helped with the milking, and we helped, of course, with the chickens and things like that. But we spent more of our time on the horses out in the pastures, helping round up the cattle. Feeding the cattle, I carried many a sack of cake. I was asked one time, can you throw a sack of cake over your shoulder? I had to show them that I could, because that was our work.
Yes.
We brought it in by the wagon load, and we just picked up a sack of cake, threw it over our shoulders, and went out and fed cattle. It's the same as the men did.
Yes.
And we had our hay meadows. That was where now they do so much planting. At that time we had the nice meadows. The grass was so good. And it was put up in the fall. But
tell us how it was put up.
Well, they would mow it off and rake it
Using
up.
horses, of course.
And using horses, and the piece of machinery that I remember the name of, and yet I couldn't tell you exactly how it looked, but it was the Go Devil. And it had prongs out on it where it raised up the hay. I know I used to like to ride on it. to when they'd take the hay up in the air and then dump me and the hay both off on
Oh.
the stack.
Yes. That was a
But
lot of fun for you.
it was fun, and I remember that.
Uh-huh.
But we did help more with the cattle than anything else.
Mhm.
And we spent a great deal of our time out in the pastures.
Now, during the dust storm days, where were you and what were you doing?
I was teaching school in Spearmore, and we spent a good share of our time trying to find things because the dust was so thick that the youngsters would have to dust their desks off to find their pencils and their papers. And during the recess time, noontime, we would go out to play, but you could not see the sun because there was too much dust between us and the sun. It was just a haze. But the children went right ahead with their work, and of course we didn't have the bright lights that they have now in their schoolrooms, but they did good work. We had windows all the way around the buildings to where the light, what there was, came in. But yes,
How many grades did you teach?
the first few years, Irene Small and I both taught there. And I taught the first, second, third, and fourth, and she taught the fifth, sixth, seventh, and eighth. And then we didn't need but one teacher, and I stayed on and taught all of the grades then.
All 8 grades. Now, where was the schoolhouse located?
It was out,
How far from the old town of? It wasn't right in the town of Spearmore.
no, it was about, I believe it was a mile. When I walked from the schoolhouse, we walked a mile south and possibly a half a mile west. Because I used to walk to the Noah O'Hare's place,
There where Dan lives now?
where Dan O'Hare lives now, yes, and stay all night, and I don't remember exactly how many miles, but it seemed to me that it was a mile south and then to the west,
I
about
can't recall
about
that
a half-
schoolhouse.
half mile. It,
When did it disband? What year? And
well, there were several teachers there after I was there, and I don't really remember what year they did cease having school there.
was that your first school?
That was my first school, yes,
That would be in what year about?
in 31.
In 31.
And I taught there until 35, and then I taught bluegrass, 35 and 36, and then I married in 36. But
The dirt. Let's go back to the dirt storms. Did you live at home when you were teaching at Spearmore, and did you drive down there
part
or
of
ride?
the time, and then I started with staying with Charlie McKee's that lived just to the north of Spearmore, just about 3/4 of a mile, and walked from there. In fact, one day the snow was so deep that Irene Smalley, the other teacher, and I carried Devona and Jack McKee on our backs to school because the snow was too deep for them to walk.
What year was that, do you remember?
I imagine that was about possibly 32 or 33 that we carried them on our backs.
Well, that was quite a blizzard that time, I remember. Do you remember the Black Sunday?
Yes, I do. I had just gotten to the McKees on that particular evening, just before that came up, and my mother and sister Rowena were just leaving. And I worried and worried, but they did get to the old Kaufman place, which was about 7 or 8 miles from there, and my father found them there. But they're at the McKees, where I had gotten the little girl, Marjorie, 3 years old, had gone outside, and they wondered where in the world Marjorie was. Well, Charlie nor Stella, either one, knew, other than that she'd gone outside. So we all ran outside. I went south, one of them went east, one went west, and I happened to be the lucky one to find her. And I ran back to the house and yelled and told them I had found her, and they came back. And the dust was so thick that we ran into one another, couldn't see one another, but we felt our way down into the basement and ran water in the basement and wet our faces with a rag. And we stayed down there until the dust wasn't so dense. But you couldn't see anything. It was just as thick as it could be. But you could easily run into someone right beside you.
And little Margie, how far from the house had she gotten?
Oh, she was only possibly a couple 100 foot from the house, but there was no way to see her at all.
No.
Because you couldn't see hardly your hand in front of you.
Oh my, that was a terrible ordeal.
It was, and it was frightening when
Yes.
you had a little 3-year-old. And there were others that were lost that day. In fact, the little boy, and I don't remember who it was now, Laverne, and they found him, but people searched and searched. It took quite a long while to find him, but they did find him safe and brought him back to Laverne. But probably lots of people were lost out in that day.
Yes.
Many people thought it was the end of the world.
Yes. Well, you had reason to believe it when you couldn't see your hand before your face.
No one had ever seen anything like it before.
Yes.
And
I don't want to say it again, but how long did it last? Do you remember?
It lasted all evening.
But it did get
Through the night, it began to clear a little bit. And by the next day, you could see, but there was lots of dust still in the air. But only through, probably 6 or 7 hours that it was just so terrible. It frightened the person.
That was April, what, 14th?
I believe it was.
1935. Did you teach school the next day?
Yes. Oh, yes. We never stopped school because of the dust storms. Even when it was so dusty we could hardly see, we still had school. But
And at school in those days, you didn't have hot lunches, did you?
we started the hot lunches because we had one family that didn't have food, had so little food.
What school was this?
This was at Spearmore.
At Spearmore.
At the Spearmore School. And people said, we will send what we have. And some would send milk, someone else would send beans, someone else would send something else. We used our big pot-bellied stove in the wintertime to make soups, cook our beans. But we did. We had meals because we had this one family that just did not have food to eat. And there were 3 of them, 2 boys and 1 little girl. And they really did appreciate the fact. The rest of the people did have a little food. No one had a great deal. But what they did have, they brought and shared, and everyone had food.
And everyone had a hot meal then
Everyone
at the
had
noon
a
hour.
hot meal. We had a good hot.
Well, that helped this
Yes.
family out because their children were being fed.
And they didn't want to accept handouts at all.
Yes.
They were very proud. But they did appreciate very much the fact that we did see to it that their children had plenty of food.
And now, what was the next school you taught?
Bluegrass school.
Bluegrass. And how long did you teach there?
I just taught for 1 year because I married then.
Oh. And then did you quit teaching for a time?
I quit teaching until in '49, my youngest child, a girl, Diane, was born, and they didn't have a teacher. They had searched and could not find a teacher. They did find one lady who was something over 80 years of age who said she would come and live in the schoolhouse, but would rather not because she'd have to have someone with her. So I told them I would teach school until they found someone. I started teaching, and 2 weeks later they came and told me that they had found their teacher, and I asked who, and they said, "You are it."
Oh.
So I taught there until I felt that there weren't enough students to,
And what school was that?
that was Catesby,
Catesby.
to keep the school going, because I felt that they really needed more students, more competition. So by doing that, well, they decided then to transfer into the Shattuck and Laverne districts, because we did live to the north, and they felt that it should be transferred on into the
And
Laverne district.
what year did you and your husband marry, and who is your husband?
Roy Hoch, and we married in 1936.
And what did he do then?
He was a farmer.
He was a farmer. You lived...
On the farm at Catesby, and we lived there until in 1956 Harry Shackelford came out and asked if I would start teaching in Laverne. So I decided that I was supposed to go back to the Lovell School, but they released me, and I came.
That's right, you did teach at Lovell. Was that after you quit Catesby?
Yes, yes. I stayed out a year with my little girl, and that was the only year since she'd been born that I had stayed home. And the next year, she would be going to school. So I stayed home that 1 year, and then the next year I started teaching and taught Lovell.
How many grades at Lovell?
All of the grades.
All 8 grades.
All 8 grades.
So many people can't believe that one teacher could teach 8th grade.
It's
Tell us how you managed a school day.
Oh, it was wonderful. I liked all of the 8 grades because the older students helped the younger students. And the younger ones learned so very much from the older ones. In fact, when I went to school, that was the way half of my learning was from listening in. But the older ones appreciated so much being able to help the little ones, and they learned a great deal by helping the younger ones. But you could put possibly 5th and 6th grade English together, or 7th and 8th grade, because they were working on the same areas, and one semester you could work with one, and next semester, but they were so interested in so many things. In the Catesby school, they were especially interested in 4-H. And we had boys and girls go to Stillwater, and we won. 1 year we won all of the contests and the county contests. We won the track meet, the educational meet, and the 4-H club meet. They couldn't understand how all 8 grades in one school could possibly do that. But because they worked together, and that was their entertainment. And they loved that kind of work. And that's the way with all of these rural schools. In the Lovell School, they worked together, the older ones with the younger ones, and they learned from one another. And then I started teaching. In '56, I started teaching in Laverne and taught 1st grade 20 years. And I enjoyed every year of it. I've substituted ever since, but not in just the 1st grade.
So then you moved to Laverne when Mr. Shackelford invited you to come in.
Yes,
You
the
moved
first
to-
year I lived in the Klinger house, but
Mhm.
after that, why, I owned the house here in Laverne, and the people living in it moved out, and so we moved into it, and my youngsters graduated here in Laverne,
Mhm.
and
Uh,
lived there ever since.
Tell us, give us the name of your children. You-
Forrest Hoch is the oldest one. Don Edward Hoch. Forrest works for Atlantic Richfield. Don is an instructor in Kansas. He lives in El Dorado, Kansas. He has taught shop work for 20-some years there.
Mhm.
And Alfred Lynn Hoch is the third boy, and he is in Brazil. He does medical research with the Walter Reed Hospital in Washington, D.C. And then Diane, my daughter, and she works at Western State Hospital. That's Fly.
Now let's go back just a little bit. Can you remember your father telling about Spearmore? Can you describe the town of Spearmore to me, and how did it get its name, Spearmore?
From the family Spears and Moores, and they put the two names together and got the name Spearmore. But I remember when I was just real small that we used to go to Spearmore and buy groceries.
Mhm.
And in fact, we went there and they used to have dances, and that was entertainment for the whole community. And I remember my folks going there.
Did they ever have a band in Spearmore?
Well, just the different men played together.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, because and whenever they did get together for their little dances and things, the men played. My father was a violin player.
Oh. Mm-hmm.
I always wanted to learn to play the violin, but he let another man borrow his violin one time, and that was the last of the violin.
Oh.
So I didn't get to learn to play the violin,
Yes.
and I wasn't very musical,
Mhm.
possibly in the first place, but there was nothing that he couldn't play.
Well.
He used to play every place we went,
Mm-hmm.
and
And that was your fun time, was these dances.
yes,
Probably
but
when
people
on-
used to get together and they had parties, everyone's home,
Mm-hmm.
and people used to go to the homes for dinners. I can remember Dad, different times, he would decorate our backyard, and everybody in the country would come there, and they would build up tables all across the yard. We'd have ice cream and all kinds of things there,
Mhm.
and entertainment. It was just
Picnics.
as if you went to a carnival now, you'd think
Yes.
about it, because
Mhm.
it was just a fun time for everyone.
And I suppose did they play baseball
They played, yes, they
And-
played baseball and
and pitch horseshoes?
pitched horseshoes.
Tell us how the horseshoe game went.
Well, they would put stakes so far apart, and then the men would get back and throw the horseshoe and try to ring it around the stake. And if you could ring it around the stake, well, you had won. And if you threw it more times than anyone else, you were the winner. But that was the thing, was to see if you could throw that horseshoe and make it land around the
Mhm.
stake.
Do they play that game anymore?
Some people do, yes. You hear of people playing horseshoe
Mhm.
occasionally. Boys and girls played it. And croquet was another game that we played a great deal. We used to have croquet set at home, and we had our backyard, we had it staked off, and people came, we played croquet.
Mhm.
All,
And then
Things like
the
that
children would have their games. And
yes. Picnics. There was nothing, even when we were in school. we took our lunches over in the pasture and sat on a rock and ate our lunch. And sometimes, if it was real nice, we walked down to the river and went wading during the noon hour.
Oh,
So,
well, that was good. That was good exercise and got you out of the schoolroom. Then when you came back, you'd settle down and study.
yes. And they had lots of games. And the boys always dug a cave. That was one thing. Every school I think I taught at, the boys did dig, or even when I went to school, the boys dug a cave.
That was their plaything.
That was play for them.
Mm-hmm.
But they had lots of games and even played basketball. But ciphering matches, geography matches,
Spelling
matches, oh yes. I was so proud one time I spelled my mother down. She was a wonderful speller. And I spelled her down on the word plow. She spelled it P-L-O-U-G-H. That was the old spelling.
Yes.
And I spelled it P-L-O-W, the new spelling, and that was the one they wanted. And I spelled her down, and that was because she was a good speller, and I was always considered a poor speller.
Oh, that made you happy to
Oh, yes.
outspell your
Yes,
mother.
Indeed. But the last day of school, everyone came to the school, and we had a last day of school dinner.
Mm-hmm.
And all out in every rural school, that's what they did,
Yes.
was get together on the last day of school and have a big dinner.
The whole district would come.
Everyone, and quite often they'd have geography matches, spelling matches, or ciphering matches. But we even went to other schools and had ciphering matches and things.
You would match.
Our school against another school, and quite often these were at night even. But yes, and that was entertainment at school, was on Friday afternoon where you had a spelling match, ciphering match, or geography match, and you learned a great deal about geography that way as well as
That's right.
ciphering, arithmetic and spelling.
Mm-hmm. Well, what about Christmas in the early days? How did your grandmother manage Christmas? Did they have a tree?
We had a tree and people brought gifts, but nothing like you find now.
Mm-hmm.
It was just a little trinket of some kind. And everyone thoroughly enjoyed Christmas, but it might be just a little horn, might be a little doll, little drum, but there would just be one gift for each person. But every person got a gift off of the tree.
And everybody was satisfied and happy.
Everyone was very happy because to them one gift was wonderful.
Yes.
But they did. They had the tree, and usually they had it at the schoolhouse,
Yes.
wherever the schoolhouse was, and everyone went.
Well, you
And
would
they had
have
a little program.
you'd have to cut a tree bare limbs, wouldn't you? And or did you have evergreens up there on the
They
creek?
had evergreen trees. My grandfather's place was just covered with them.
Oh.
Oh yes, he had green trees everywhere,
Uh-huh.
and lots of other trees.
What
lots
kind
of
of
fruit
trees were they?
Cottonwood trees, or the cedar tree was.
The cedar. He had a lot of cedars.
Lots of cedar trees, but he had lots of fruit trees too.
Well, I mean for a Christmas tree.
But the cedar tree was what they used for Christmas. Yes, it was a green tree, and they always went cut a tree
Mm-hmm.
and placed it in the schoolhouse, and everybody went to the schoolhouse. And as I say, the school children always put on a program of some kind.
And that was something you all looked forward
Oh
to.
yes, Christmas was wonderful.
In Second World War, did any of your family have to go to the Second?
No, none of my family was, because they were always taking care of the growing food for the people that did go, and of course the ranching, that was meat for them, and none of them,
None of them
just the
had to go.
immediate family. Now then, I had an uncle, yes, who did go, James Criswell.
Hmm. Now, your mother was a Criswell.
Yes, she was Criswell, and her brother, James, did go to the service. And he was in Germany and in England.
Yes, but was he injured?
No,
Uh-huh.
no. He came back. He was out on the ocean. They had ship trouble, and he floated out on the ocean, I believe it was, on a life raft for 11 days. But they were rescued,
Uh-huh.
and but not injured.
Mhm.
Yes.
Well, was their ship torpedoed or something that they were on?
It apparently had been, because there were several of the boys in I believe it was New Guinea. They talked about that one of the men wanted to go out and do some investigating, and he said that he was too tired. He didn't want to go with him, and this man went, and they found him later. And one of those huge snakes, and I've forgotten what kind it was, had tried to swallow him, but it had killed him.
Well.
But that was just
Hmm. Then
accident.
he was in that area. Your
But he-
uncle was.
Yes, and
Do you remember any other stories that he told?
well, that was he didn't tell a great deal about her, just about this boy and then about being out on the ocean.
He was
And
in the
then-
Navy then.
Yes.
Yeah.
And well, however, he was in England and he was in Germany too.
Mhm.
But
Was he sent to the Pacific then after the war was over? Some of the boys, had to go to the Pacific.
well, he did. So I
Mhm.
suppose that he was one of them that was sent there.
And
I really
that's-
hadn't given it much thought, but I just remember him telling this story about the boy that was killed by the snake.
Hmm. Then that would be in 42 and 43, wouldn't it? Somewhere along in there, during World War II.
Let's see. No, that was that would have had to have been earlier than that. Let's see, where the Second World War was in 41 too, wasn't it?
Yes.
Well, I was just thinking it must have been then, because he would have been.
Did he tell?
He would have been 18 in 19. No, he wouldn't, because he was born in 1910. That's right. So it would have been in 41, 42.
Did he tell about his experience on the water in this boat? What did they have to eat, or how did they manage?
I don't remember. Germany, I remember him mentioning the fact that he thought it was a wonderful place to live, would be in Germany. And I don't remember exactly why he was there, but I do remember him talking about it being such a nice place to live, and that he didn't care too much for London in England, that he liked Germany better.
Germany was a beautiful country.
Better than he did England.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell me a little bit about the Criswell Ranch, where they lived, your mother's people?
It was just to the north of where we lived, right on the Kiowa River, and it's right to the north of the Bockelman place now. In fact, the Bockelman's probably, I don't know for sure. No, they don't own that place. I believe the Lavertys own that place now.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just about a mile from where we lived.
Yes. And your grandfather Criswell's name was?
Harb
Criswell.
Yes. And he didn't live there too many years. He went back to Selden, Kansas. He worked in oil products and was a salesman and traveled a good share of the time.
But your mother was raised on the ranch.
Yes.
And her life would be very much parallel to what you've told me about
Yes.
your father's people.
Yes, because they were living there then.
Uh-huh.
And
Well, didn't she teach school?
No,
No?
no, mother never did teach school. She was just 15 when she married.
Oh.
She wasn't very old. But back then, why, a good many people did marry at
Yes.
an early age.
Yes, that's right. All right, can you think of anything more that might be interesting to your grandchildren later on?
Well, not in particular. I remember things that happened to us, but then I'm not so sure that they'd be so interested.
Can you tell me one of them?
Well, I was one of those persons always getting hurt.
Uh-huh.
But we had racehorses. My dad was a racehorse man. He loved horses more than just about anything. And we always had racehorses. And my sister and I went, we were going over to the Criswell Ranch. My Aunt Ethel and Charlie at that time were living there. And she always had something planned when she knew we were coming, but we were taking the mail. The river had been up and they hadn't gotten their mail for several days, so we were taking, the mail came to our box because it didn't go by their place. We were taking it over to them. And I was on a horse named Streaker, the one that they raced, and my sister, Thelma, was on Old Barrel. He was a big, lumbering horse, but a good horse. And we started out and we started galloping. But the horse I was on, having been used to running, started running. And of course the one she was on wanted to catch up. And we got to going pretty fast. And we got over to my Aunt Ethel's and they headed for the barn. The horse I was on went right up to the barn door, stuck his feet in the ground, and you could see a year later where he stuck those feet in the ground and threw me completely over the other horse. And my aunt, though she had plans for us, she was going to be holding church when we got there. But when she saw me, they immediately had to send for my folks because it completely knocked me out. And it took, well, a call to the doctor, and he got there, and I was just beginning to come to. But that was one of their exciting events at that time.
I would think so.
But that was, well, we were just taking the mail over to them. Supposedly a very innocent affair, but it turned out to be rather exciting.
Well, did your father race these horses?
Oh, yes. He raced horses for years and years.
What were some of his famous horses?
Smiling Princess. I named her Black Beauty, and he gave her to me. And then I found out that there was another horse named Black Beauty, so they changed her name to Smiling Princess. And they took her down in Tijuana, Mexico. They won a race, but at that time they had what they called claimed races. And sure enough, why, if you didn't let your horse go, you had so many minutes, but if you didn't let your horse go, why, you couldn't race there anymore. And he did save his horse by immediately, and Dad told the fellow who was taking care of the horse to bring her back immediately, and so they did. But the last I knew, supposedly Tom Mix had bought her in California.
Oh, how wonderful. So she went on to a career of her own.
So I suppose that she did. But then we had, a lot of horses, and I don't remember. It just so happened that these particular names stayed with me. But he did racing right up until he had a stroke and had to quit. But he used to go to Omaha and just all around to the races. But and people said that his race barn stalls, the place that he kept his horses, were cleaner than most people's houses. He believed in, well, cleanliness was always one of his beliefs, because he always told us when we were little, you may be poor, but you can still shine your shoes and keep your hair combed and be clean.
Yes.
And that was the way he was with his horses. They were always polished and ready to run.
What was the largest number that he had at one time? Do you remember?
He didn't usually keep more than 2 or 3 race horses.
Mm-hmm. Well, now, did he take them to races before we had the trucks and the trailers to move them in? Or how would he move his horses?
Well,
from
they
place
used to have
place?
races in this part of the country.
Oh, they did?
Yes, even over on Granddad Petty's place, they had a racing area there.
I see.
And they see the Laverne and just the short distances away. But by that time, they had transportation for horses.
Mm-hmm.
Because I remember the first time that we had a car, I don't remember exactly the year, but they told him to be careful when he crossed the creek,
Mm-hmm.
because you could kill the motor on a car. But he thought if you stepped on the gas and went across it fast, well, you'd be all right. But I was, not too old when we got our first car, but
Mm-hmm.
so they did have transportation for their horses,
Mhm.
and by the time he was really racing horses,
Yes.
and took them all over the country.
And did
But they did take them by train. a
That's
long
what I was
distance.
wondering.
They took them by train if it was a long distance.
Yes.
I was 4 years old when I went to the first Ringling Brothers Circus in Woodward.
Now,
And
what year would that be?
that would have been 1914. Because I was born in 1910, and I was
Mhm.
4 years old. That was my first circus, and I remember seeing them it looked as if they put a lot of wool into a mailbox, and then they'd pull out a puppy.
Oh.
And I saw the elephants dance, all kinds of things like that. which
And you remember it?
Oh, yes. And in fact, Russell Lyon, who became a very prominent man in Laverne,
Yes.
he sang the day that I was there, and I remembered his name. He and 3 other young men sang there at Woodward. A quartet sang, and
Mhm.
I remember always his singing.
Well.
It was a very entertaining day, but I did get lost, and I looked up, and sure enough, when I looked up, I was following a black family. And pretty soon my folks found me, but
Mhm.
I proceeded to get lost because I was looking at feet rather than looking up to
Yes.
see who I was following.
Uh-huh. Well, it would be easy for a child to get lost in a crowd like that.
But it was so far away, we stayed all night down there.
Yes.
Because we went down on the train.
Uh-huh.
And of course
And you went to the hotel,
yes.
and that was quite an outing.
Oh, yes,
for
because
the
it was so
family.
huge at that time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And in fact, I got lost in the hotel one time, and I went to the door that I was so sure was ours, and sure enough, there was a strange man in the room, and I had to get back out in the hall till they found me. But
Well, it sounds like you've had a very, very interesting life. As one lady said to me the other day, she said, well, this day has been worth living. And I think your life has been worth living, don't you?
oh, I've enjoyed it.
Yes.
I've done
Yes, I can see you have. Everything, you can appreciate these things. You're a type person who can appreciate these things.
so many people do not understand that things to them are hard now, but they should go back and live through some of that other, because I can quite easily remember giving my last 35 cents to my husband for him to go to get his check down at Arnett, because you just didn't have money back in those dust storm days.
Yes.
And
Did your husband ever work on the WPA, the Works Progress Administration?
he said that he never did happen.
Uh-huh.
He was always farming. His father died early, and he did the farming.
Mm-hmm.
But when you had 2 or 3 cans of something then, well, you thought you were getting along fine. That was
Yes.
wonderful. Now it'd be a different story.
Yes.
But, no, you raised your chickens and your meat, and raised
And
your
you-
gardens.
Mm-hmm. Jackson interviewing Laura Hoch, um, October the 16th, 1984. Laura, tell me about the first relatives that came to No Man's Land, and what year did they come?
That would be my grandfather, George Washington Petty, and his wife, who came here in 1885. They were among the very first white people to settle here. They lived in a dugout, and most of their children came with them, but the younger ones were born after they arrived here, and they found out that it was a very interesting place to live. Grandfather had wanted to move to Texas, but when grandmother saw this area, she said, no, this is my home. This is where I want to stay. And they did stay there, and they became successful farmers or ranchers, because they had cattle as well as doing all the farming. And of course, that was when you walked behind your plow. It was pulled by a horse, or possibly more than that if you had the larger plow. You hoed your corn. You didn't go out and work it by team or any other way. Grandfather said, you hoe the corn, and that was the way it was worked. My dad, who was Alfred Petty, and my aunt Ethel Petty, said that for entertainment, grandfather would give them seed, and they would go down and feed the fish. That was their job, was to feed the fish.
You lived on a creek?
Right on the Camp Creek, yes.
On Camp Creek.
Fed into the Kiowa River. And it was a nice sized creek. He put in a large vineyard. There were always lots of grapes. He had a huge garden, several acres. And Grandmother Petty spent a good share of her time taking garden vegetables to different families in the country. I remember riding with her in the buggy, and we would go all over the country and take fruit, because they had apple trees, peach trees, pear trees, and we took fruit to various people. But that was one of her jobs, was to see that everybody had fresh vegetables and fruit whenever they had it.
That's wonderful. What state did they come from?
Indiana.
And why did they move here?
Everyone was talking about going west, so they decided to go west. And someone had told them how wonderful Texas was, that it was the most wonderful place in the world and dirt cheap to live there. But when they stayed the night, they had arrived here, Grandmother said, no farther, this is my home. And so that's why they stayed in Oklahoma.
How did they come? Did they come by covered wagon, or
Yes, they came by covered
all the
wagon.
way through from Indiana?
Yes, and I've forgotten now, but it told from Kansas, I believe it was, on down here, that it took, 17 days. It was in the winter time, I believe it was, and it took 17 days to come through. And I don't have any idea how long it took to come all the rest of the distance, because I never did hear them say.
Mm-hmm.
But they did.
Did they bring their cattle with them? And
Yes, the older boys walked and drove the cattle.
mm-hmm. All right, and when they settled on this beautiful creek with the high grass, I suppose the grass was good along that creek.
Yes, it was very good.
Uh-huh. They had how many children at that time? Can you name their children for me and tell me which ones was born here?
Well, the ones that Grover and Harry,
Oh, tell me about their...
Sadie were born before they arrived, and then Ethel and Alfred and Gertie and May after they arrived here.
Tell me about them naming their children after the presidents.
I have never known the reason why, but grandfather was George Washington Petty, so I decided that he just liked presidents' names.
Mm-hmm.
And Grover was Grover Cleveland, and then there was Cal, a member of the family. It was Calvin Coolidge,
Well,
and it was just
it's just
something that he liked.
that
was
he liked.
presidents that I suppose that he liked, and he
Mhm.
wanted them named after the presidents.
And then which ones were born here?
The ones that were born here were Ethel, Alfred, Gertie, and May.
And May was supposed to have been the first
White child born in no man's land.
Mhm.
The Indians were still here, and I have heard them talk about grandmother taking the youngsters and hiding whenever she would see the Indians coming, because she didn't know whether they were friendly or not, but found
Mhm.
out that they were. And they used to trade with the Indians and had a good many trinkets, but no one thought anything about it, and they weren't saved.
Well,
Because I remember my dad had a lot of Indian trinkets that he had traded for, and we just didn't think to save those things. We didn't realize that later on we would give anything to have them.
mhm. And how close was their closest neighbor?
There were other dugouts within just a very short distance, I would say a mile or two from them
Mhm.
at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And the Tafts lived on to the north, and they were about, I imagine about 3 miles from
Mhm.
where they lived. And I remember when I was small, of course this was much later, but Grover Stevenses lived just across the highway, or the road that was made through there from them. And in fact, I was born at Grandfather Petty's place.
Oh, you were born on that
I
place.
was
Mhm.
born there.
Do you? Can you tell me when they built their sod house? You said or
Well, offhand, I can't think.
is there any part of that sod house still standing?
Well, no, not the first, the dugout, but the house, yes. And the house was all interlined with sod that is
Oh.
still there, that the hired help live in.
I see.
Or at least they were living there the last I knew. But they lived in that house, yes.
And that farm that is still in some member of the family owns it.
Yes, Robert Taft owned the place after his mother died. It was because she took care of grandmother Petty in her later years, was given the place, and then Robbie took it over, and
And Robbie's mother is
May Taft.
May Petty Taft.
May Petty Taft,
Yes.
yes. And May stayed there with grandmother while she was ill, and then at one time she did live with Ethel Petty Criswell in Laverne, but then she went back and stayed with May, and May stayed with her until she died.
Mhm.
And that way the place, then they let May have the place, and it belongs to Ida Taft.
Mhm.
Still has it.
Robbie's
And then Frances,
widow.
who is
And
married
his
to
daughter. Mhm.
the prophet, and
Well,
they run the place.
Your